Thank you very much. It's always a privilege and an honor to be back here for another ICT summit, and I want to congratulate Boaz Ganor again on putting together another splendid meeting. You'll have to excuse my voice. One of the risks of living on airplanes is I got a summer cold, and I'm just getting over it, so I sound a little bit raspy. Yesterday, we remembered the victims of 9/11. Today is the 15th anniversary of the day after, and that has importance because while the United States, its allies, others around the world were still in shock from 9/11, the day after was really the beginning of the effort to understand what had happened and, more importantly, to put together an effort that would involve intelligence, diplomacy, law enforcement work, military activities that would be an appropriate response to this unprecedented event. I was asked this summer by West Point's Counter-Terrorism Center if now 15 years after we had begun that effort, if I would try to write an assessment of where we are. And this was published last week in the 100th issue of their journal, the Sentinel. You know, Americans are a pragmatic people, and we want to know what is the return on our investment. How are we doing? Are we winning or losing? Or at the very least, are we making progress? Measuring progress in any kind of irregular warfare without front lines is always difficult. Given the different dimensions and multiple fronts of this campaign against Al-Qaeda and its progeny make it an exceptional challenge. Each geographic front, each field of action has to be looked at separately, and that results in a more complicated balance sheet. In some areas, our counter-terrorist efforts have been successful. In other areas, certainly far less so. And for every plus or minus on that balance sheet, there is a however. So we can say we're doing well here, however, or we're not doing so well here, however. And so taking a look at that, on the plus side, we would say, first, our worst fears have not been realized. Now, many would hasten to add, yet. But certainly our immediate concern after 9/11 was the likelihood of another 9/11 scale attack. And we certainly know that our adversaries were contemplating such efforts, and so immediate action was required to degrade their operational capabilities so that they would not be able to do so. We haven't seen that, and we haven't seen any of the worst case scenarios that were predicted as likely to take place in the dark shadow of 9/11. Keep in mind at that time, the worst terrorist incidents in the 1970s were measured in tens of fatalities. By the 1980s, the worst terrorist incidents were measured in the hundreds of fatalities. And of course, on 9/11, we ascended into the thousands of fatalities, and had the evacuation of the World Trade Center towers not had been so efficient, we would have been looking at something in the tens of thousands. And so it was easy to extrapolate future terror scenarios in which we would be looking at tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of fatalities. That has not occurred. The operational capabilities Al-Qaeda and ISIS remain limited. Both organizations have been the beneficiaries of fortune. I'm sure they would say the beneficiaries of God's will. But the fact is that when we look carefully at their successes in places like Syria and Iraq, it has less to do with their military prowess, and it has more to do with the collapse of these of the armies that oppose them. This is not the Wehrmacht that we are dealing with, and despite some inappropriate language from generals who should know better, this is not World War III. I know that Secretary of Homeland Security Johnson said yesterday that we have to expect more Orlando-type attacks. Certainly that was a tragedy in which 49 people were killed, but if one measures a 9/11 in which nearly 3,000 were killed and we're down to a level in which 49 were killed, that, although still not enough, represents significant progress. Neither Al-Qaeda nor ISIS have become a mass movement. Of course, this was what it was all about, to arouse followers throughout Islam. To be sure, both organizations continue to attract a degree of sympathy. According to all of the polls that we have, there is widespread disapproval, even in the communities they regard as their constituents, although it is a significant enough minority to still comprise fairly large numbers of individuals. So there still is a not insignificant reservoir here. The constellation of jihadist groups, I know it's alarming when we look at a map of North Africa and the Middle East and we see all of these countries, whether they're painted red on the map or black on the map, where ISIS flags or Al-Qaeda flags have been raised. It's not quite as meaningful as it seems. To be sure, there has been growth by acquisition, growth by branding. A lot of this is public relations. A lot of these organizations that have signed up for one or the other really reflect long-standing local grievances that have been persuaded that there is an advantage in their own situation or over their rivals to embrace one of these larger organizations. But for the most part, they still are focused on local quarrels. There is no central command to this. There are no joint operations. The connections still here are still tenuous. Also on the plus side is the fact that while terrorists can kill, destroy, disrupt, create alarm, oblige us to divert vast resources into security efforts, they have found it difficult to convert these into permanent political gain. So in that sense, they have not succeeded. And that, I include the Islamic State in that assessment. ISIS is losing territory, and as a territorial entity, as a functioning state, it can be defeated. Progress is slow, but it's faster than a lot of the analysts thought it would be as recently as 2 years ago. The continuing calls by both Al-Qaeda and ISIS on local terrorist supporters in the West to take action have thus far produced only a meager response. Now, that sounds odd given some of the recent events we've seen in Europe and in the United States. But we have to keep in mind history here. You know, during the Algerian War, in the 1950s and up until 1962, 5,000 people were killed in France alone. During the IRA campaign, 3,600 people were killed. We are not looking at those numbers, certainly yet. Now, to be sure, Europe faces a more serious threat, a more imminent threat than we face in the United States. The numbers of foreign fighters who have gone from Europe is measured in the thousands. In the United States, we're looking at perhaps a couple of hundred. Indeed, in the United States, the terrorist attacks and the terrorist plots that have been uncovered by the authorities connected with ISIS, 2/3 of those have been the products of a single individual, or in the other cases, the products of very tiny conspiracies. Now, the good news is they're tiny. That means limited capabilities. The bad news is that is a tough target for intelligence. We don't have an X-ray for a man's soul. Nonetheless, our intelligence has been fairly effective in interrupting about 90% of these plots. On the minus side, the targets of this international campaign, the U.S.-led military campaign, have survived U.S. counter-terrorist efforts. They're still there. They are resilient. They are adaptive. They have morphed to meet new circumstances, and so they're still there. Nor can we claim to have dented their determination. And this is extremely difficult to do. These are organizations, these are ideologies that regard the struggle as process-oriented rather than progress-oriented. What do I mean by that? I mean that they derive psychological benefit from their demonstrated commitment to continued fighting. Victory at the tactical level or defeat is in God's hands. They believe that they are on God's side, and therefore ultimately they must prevail over us because we are not on their God's side. Now that is very, very difficult to dent that kind of determination. They do have, unquestionably, a powerful ideology. It arouses extreme devotion, and it remains just a very, very strong, has very, very strong appeal. Now, fortunately, while they can disseminate that broadly through social media, via the internet, it is still a very, very narrow response that they are getting. ISIS in particular has been effective in its use of social media, as was pointed out by Dr. Khan. But at the same time, while they have advertised atrocity as evidence of their authenticity, this has turned out to be a magnet for the mentally disturbed, for marginal individuals. And we are seeing actions by very troubled individuals. In fact, in the United States, probably the most common attribute of those who are joining this or taking action on its behalf is personal crisis. These are troubled individuals who embrace this ideology because it resonates with their own anger and aggression and sense of trouble. On the negative side also is the fact that the fighting in Syria and Iraq will almost certainly continue. I know that the diplomats are desperate to bring about a truce in that fighting, but the external actors have competing agendas. that's not going to be easy. For those who are on the ground, this struggle is largely existential. The fighting, I believe, will go on. The loss of territory will not persuade ISIS to quit. We should have no illusions about that when Mosul or Raqqa fall, as ultimately they will, although those could, if they choose, turn out to be extremely difficult, bloody contests. But when that happens, this is not over. Our opponents have plan Bs. They may relocate to a different jihadist front. They've tried to do so in Libya. They can go underground and continue the struggle. And so one outcome will be a persistent, bloody insurgency in Syria and Iraq. Syria and Iraq will remain fragile states, arenas of international competition, sources of continued violence, and regional instability. I believe that the partitions that we see in both Syria and Iraq will persist. I don't believe that either government, even with external assistance, will be able to restore its authority throughout its national territory. Power on the ground has shifted from national institutions to militias that are under local control or foreign control. So there has been a fundamental power shift. If we look at some of these enclaves, some of them are economically viable, perhaps a rectangle in western Syria that is under Alawite domination, perhaps the Kurdish territory, a portion of South Syria under the Shias. But that leaves the most dangerous part of all, and that is a vast Sunni persistent badlands. Right now, ISIS and the rebel formations are the only political and military expressions of that territory. I have said this before, and I suspect I will be saying this again if I'm here next year. The world will be dealing with the effluence of the conflicts in Syria and Iraq for years to come. I mentioned that it is possible that ISIS will go underground and continue an insurgency in both Syria and Iraq. Foreign fighters cannot survive an underground contest in Syria and Iraq. They are foreigners. They will either have to migrate to new jihadist fronts elsewhere, or they will fight to the death, or some of them will come home. And we've heard that reports that some of them are already drifting back. Of those who return, some are traumatized, some are disillusioned, some are determined to continue the jihad at home. So one consequence of our increasing military success on the ground in Syria and Iraq could in fact be a spike in terrorist activity worldwide as these foreign fighters scatter. Refugees will continue to pose a long-term challenge to society and security. The continuation of the fighting, the perilous situation in Syria and Iraq, means that they will not be able to return. This flow of refugees has been augmented by economic immigrants and infiltrated by some terrorists. In that flow, especially that refugee flow to Europe, many will be able to assimilate and settle down, but in that flow is a large proportion of single young males. Now that's always a problematic demographic. It is especially so in this case because these are young men with very little education coming from very violent environments. Now, This is not the Germany of the 1960s where they need 500,000 Turkish workers to assemble Volkswagens. The jobs are high-tech, they demand education, and it is going to be difficult for these fellows. They are going to spend a long time in refugee camps, in centers. Some will become impatient, angry. Some of them will turn to crime. They will all be targets for radicalization. The U.S. faces a multi-tiered threat. That has the threat of infiltration by outsiders, I think, has diminished. The number of foreign fighters is small, but certainly the concern that we have is inspiration from abroad. The U.S. is now better organized to deal with that, but perhaps our biggest vulnerability right now is that America's citizens remain fearful. Indeed, I would say here that America's frightened, angry, divided society remains the country's biggest vulnerability. In many, many cases, the progress that has been achieved in dealing with terrorism is almost completely divorced from the perceptions of the American public. And rather than appeal to traditional American values of courage, of self-reliance, of sense of community, of tolerance, our current political system seems to incentivize the creation of fear. So after 15 years on balance, a lot has changed. Progress has been made, and indeed, by any measure, Americans are safer. But no, we are not through it yet. Thank you very much.